information on. We always refer to as, within the carcass, talk about just beef or pork, within the carcass, towards either the interior of the carcass or the posterior of the carcass, you will tend to have some tenderness differences even within the carcass. We oftentimes say, generally speaking, that muscles of locomotion, as you mentioned at the very beginning of this episode, tend to have red fibers because the animal uses it a lot to move. But then we know that even within the shoulder, we have some muscles that are tender than others. Would you please explain to us more about that in terms of so biochemically, what's going on that we see that those differences, even within the chalk, the shoulder of the animal, we see that those differences between muscles in terms of tenderness. And I guess going back to, you mentioned into the fiber type, if that's the case, how can we help to explain that? Just going back to the example, not all the muscles from the chalk are tough. You got those muscles, that petite tendon and all that. Like, is it that related to fiber type or not so much?
I honestly, Francisco, I doubt it in that case. And I've given this a lot of thought. I'm old enough now, I've thought about these things long enough, and you always think of the angles on everything. Well, so when you talk about tenderness, there's really the muscle protein overlap, right? That's how much protein overlaps. And what's the best example of that would be some things that happen. So if pre-rigor, if you pull a muscle off a carcass and it shortens, right? It's allowed to shorten, and you make steaks out of that, it's going to be tough because the muscle contracted, you interact more proteins together, it's a denser product, it's tough. So that's one way to do it. The other is the connective tissue element, right? And some muscles have more connective tissue than others. For example, in the shoulder, as you pointed out, there's more connective tissue in many of those muscles, but at the same time, if the muscle isn't responsible for doing a whole lot, it doesn't need a lot of connective tissue. And an example of that would be the psoas, right? The psoas flexes
the tenderloin for
some of you the tenderloin muscle. It flexes the hip, and cattle don't flex their hips a lot, so it doesn't have a lot of connective tissue. And then the final thing is really this whole protease thing, or how enzymes within the meat tend to degrade them. And we age meat, which is a controlled rotting meat, for lack of a better term. Those are not always the same from muscle to muscle, and certainly that could be related to fiber type, and I think there's some emerging data that suggests that. Again, out of the Utah State lab, Dr. Matarne, and also Dr. Scheffler at the University of Florida. And the energy metabolism, which is fiber type, is related to that. So it's entirely possible. I don't know for sure. I don't know of any data like that. But then you've got temperature issues and how the muscles are stretched on the carcass, and that all has a profound impact on muscle-to-muscle variation.
Good. I think we're coming almost to the end of this episode. This is a lot of information, and I hope that everyone